Well, hello. Now I know that there's something you've been trying to tell me, and I haven't been listening. When I look across all the videos that I've created since starting this channel, there is one that stands out above all the rest, in all the metrics, in views, in comments, in likes, everything. And that has to do with laser cutting and using epoxy to make a stained glass look in a project. Well, I've been putting that off, and for whatever the reason, I did finally realize that it's the project that never starts that takes the longest to complete. So we're going to get back to it today, and it's going to start with this. The interesting thing about this particular project compared to the box that I did before is that I want it to act like stained glass, like a window that passes light through it and makes it shine. Well, that's a difficult thing to do. It begs the question of how you're going to be able to get all of that epoxy of the different colors into the various different thin shapes here without having any of it bleed through. I did accomplish that on a project I did last year. It's this Christmas ornament. It's got epoxy for the night sky here, but here in this star at the top, it's actually a yellow epoxy that shines all the way through. And that was pretty cool because you could stick it on your Christmas tree in such a way that the light would shine through on this side and you'd actually see it coming through on the ornament. I did that using this simple blue tape, put it on the back and then just filled the epoxy in. But I don't think that's going to work on something this big and intricate. So I had to come up with something else. My first thought was, why don't I just epoxy the piece onto a piece of thin veneer? And then once it's all set up and I'm sanding the front side, I can flip it over and just sand off the entire veneer till I get back down to the epoxy on that side as well. And that might work. And maybe that's what I end up having to do in the end. I haven't tried any of these things yet. But it does seem like a little bit of an expensive way to go. This stuff isn't the cheapest thing in the world. So I thought, what are other thin pieces of wood that I can use? And in the end, I thought what I might try and do is to actually just use paper. And now this is a thin cardstock. And the program that I feed to the laser printer to print this out will also print ink on a regular printer on this. So my thought is, and we'll see how this goes, that we can simply epoxy this down into the place that's shown on the printed paper here with the clear epoxy. And then we can go back in and fill it all in, and we can sand this off, which is cheap compared to this veneer. I'm not sure how all that's going to work, but you can come find out with me, and we'll see what results we get. Today's build is going to be a lantern, a light to you in darkness when all other lights go out. This lantern is going to have 4 sides, and I'm going to create each one of those sides in a free program called Inkscape. You've already seen the base of one of those sides representing family. Now I want to show you how I created this one, which represents love. These geometric base shapes are common to each side of the lantern. They're not particularly interesting to draw, but the inside that is the glass is a lot more interesting. And I have to admit that while there is some talent in my family for drawing, it seems to have skipped a generation with me. So to come up with the rose pattern that I liked, I actually went to the internet and found a picture of real stained glass, which I'm bringing over and superimposing on top of this base structure. Now all that I'm interested in is these black lines that make up the borders of the cells. To capture them, I've set my stroke thickness to a 1/16 of an inch, and I'm first just making little points along the curves of those black lines. Once I have straight lines between all of those points, I can come back and finally adjust with the Bezier tool to make the curves match the curves that I want. Once all of the lines are captured, you can simply get rid of the image. The first step after drawing all of the line segments is to simplify it by selecting all those paths and using the union method in the object menu to turn them into one. At this point, your laser is still going to recognize those paths as having no thickness to them. So you next want to go up and select the stroke to path function in the object menu. The rest of the functions kind of depend on what you want to do with your project. In my case, I made an intersection with a circle to make it perfectly round, and then integrated it with the frame itself. The final result looks like this. And this is the file that I'm going to send off to my laser to cut. Once cut, it's time to attach the sides of the lantern to the temporary backing. I'm doing that by brushing on a clear epoxy both to the paper and to the piece itself. Behind it all, I've put a piece of parchment paper, which will help keep everything from sticking to my work surface. It was a little harder to see earlier, but I hope now that you can see that I've actually printed on the design onto the piece of paper that I'm gluing the piece to. The main portion of the lantern is a solid maple at 1/4 inch. And then I'm adding these little accent pieces in the corners and at the bottom with the word. These are a cherry wood, also at 1/4 inch. I found that the pieces like to float a little bit on the wet epoxy. Because of this, it took a little bit of patience to get everything to stay in place. This is especially true for those little pieces inside the letters like on A and O and R. Okay, so it has been 24 hours now, and you can see the results. It's hard to see, I'm sure, because this is clear epoxy. But it does appear as though it has soaked all the way through the paper where I wanted it to, which is good that I have this parchment paper to keep it from sticking. And it has attached itself to all the bits of the wood that go up against that paper, meaning that those cells should be closed off now. When I put the colors in there, hopefully it doesn't bleed to anywhere else. I will also tell you the one kind of rookie mistake that I made with this. And that is, if you look at this cherry piece here that I did for the contrast, you see that the grain is running vertically just like the maple. But at the top two pieces, I have it running horizontally instead. And it's a little bit of a rookie mistake not to pay attention to the grain, but I was at least consistent through all 4 pieces doing it that way. And I don't think it's so big a mistake that I need to start over. So the next step is to get onto the epoxy. And I have done in my videos and personally, I've done epoxy in a lot of different techniques now. But against some techniques, I have not yet been tested. And that is this one. So I'm not quite sure how this works out. And I will tell you one thing I am nervous about is that the epoxy that I do in the new layer with the color may not stick super well to an already hardened clear epoxy beneath it. I think that'll be all right because worst case scenario, I just have to sand through all of the clear epoxy and take a little more layer off, thinning it out a little bit. Now I can learn from my mistakes. In a recent build video, I made a backgammon board, and in that backgammon board, the points were made with inlaid epoxy just like this white. I didn't make quite enough epoxy in the first batch, and so I had to make a second. The ratio of dye to epoxy was a little bit higher in my second batch. The result of that was that the second batch looked a little whiter and the first batch looked a little grayer. I hope to use that to my advantage here when filling in the colors for this dove. I'm going to do the back feathers first, which I want to be more of a gray look, and then I'm going to add more white dye to the mix and do the bird itself. Even mixing colors like this is a little bit risky because I've learned in past experience that it's best to do one color and then let everything sit before moving on to the next. Now with epoxy, letting everything sit means waiting 24 hours. So as you watch me color in these lantern sides, you're going to see my clothes change a fair number of times. When I did the decorative box video, I was using the stick that I used to mix the epoxy to also drip in the epoxy to the little cells. I probably got a dozen comments saying that I should be using a syringe instead, so here you go. Using the syringe was alright, I guess, but in the end I switched back to using the stick again. I just felt like I had a little more control. One other difference in my methods here compared to the decorative box is that I'm not just using dye in the epoxy, I'm adding some mica powder as well, which gives it a little bit more texture than the dye would. Now rather than blab your ear off while I fill in the rest of these colors, why don't we just do a little musical montage and fill all the rest of it in. It's now been 6 days since I started the process of putting the epoxy in. It took that long to get all of these colors in and set up. I hope it didn't feel like that to you, or I'm doing a pretty bad job on my video editing. But now we're at the point where we can get to the real woodworking, and I'm excited by that. The first thing though is that I need to take and flatten down the epoxy surfaces that are here. So say goodbye to the shininess that you see right now. It's going to be gone for a little while we put it all together. Now, to get that surface nice and flat, one does not simply put it through a planer. The potential for chip out and ruining the whole thing and having to start over again is a little too high doing that, so it needs to be sanded. And in the past, I've done that sanding with an orbital sander, and I do it by hand. But I have a power sander now, a drum sander, and I'm going to go use that to flatten these down. Once I do that, we can get to the work of assembling the lantern all together and see how this is going to look in the very end. The big advantage of these drums in the deep is that they keep the piece flat as they move through. But you also have to appreciate that you just won't have a sore shoulder at the end of the day. And here you see that my idea did work. The sander's taking off the paper on the backs just fine. To join the lantern faces together, I'm going to have to cut a 45-degree miter on 2 sides of each of the face. And I'm doing that here on the table saw. For the next part, I'm going to use a laser cutter to print out a few pieces for me. These pieces help assemble the top and the bottom of the lantern. While LED lights don't give off nearly as much heat as an iridescent light would, I still want a way for heat to escape, but I also don't want light to escape. My hope is that this design allows the heat to come up through the holes in that bottom piece and out through the slots in the top piece without letting much light through. The 2 square pieces are going to provide support when gluing things together, and the bottom one has a larger hole so that it can fit the light bulb. I kind of doubt that the glue will stick very well to the charred surfaces left behind by the laser, so I'm just going to sand that down by hand a little bit to get to the real wood. This glue up turned out to be a little trickier than I had thought. I really just didn't take into account the implications of it being so thin, and the clamp that I chose to work with originally, it wasn't suited for the job. It couldn't handle something this small. The proper way to have done this would have been to use blue tape ahead of time, then put glue on the joints and put them all together. I didn't do that though, so I'm having to adjust on the fly, which is something you don't really want to do when you're gluing something up. And it can lead to problems. Which is exactly what happened right here. I put a clamp in the wrong spot and I broke through the binding of one of the pieces of epoxy. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to wait till the glue all sets up before I can attempt to repair. And here you can see where the clamp broke the bond just beneath the word hope. To fix this, I'm going to have to put some new clear epoxy in to act as the glue. That means 24 hours to wait and set up time. It also means I'm going to have to use this parchment paper to keep my clamp from sticking to the epoxy glue. While the epoxy sets up, I can begin the work on the real top and base of the lantern. I'm adding a decorative element to these pieces by cutting a cove into both sides of each edge. The heat has to pass through this top piece as well, and the laser can't make it through 3/4 of an inch. So instead I'm using this hole saw, which was actually made for cutting through 2x4s. It makes a bit of a rough edge, but in the end this part won't be visible. Before I can do the final assembly, I am going to have to put some finish on a few of the pieces that are going to be harder to reach when I'm all done. Specifically, I have this little cap that's connected by the part that lets the heat through. One other thing that I need before I assemble it is a mechanism by which I can change the light bulb. To do that, I'm going to put in some threaded inserts. Those threaded inserts are going to allow me to attach and detach the base just with a few screws. And now we have to have a little chat about electrical work. I know that quite a few people have a little bit of trepidation about doing work with electrical wires. And maybe some of that is justified, But the only thing really to fear is the part that you do not understand. And of course, if you don't understand something, the best way to fix that is just with a little bit of learning. The electrical setup here is not particularly complicated. I start with an extension cord, which I then cut the head off of. Stripping the two wires, I find out that they're stranded, which is what I expected. So I roll those wires together in order to make a connection to the light fixture. In the US, the larger of the two prongs in an electrical outlet is the neutral. And on this particular extension cord, I can find that the neutral is identified with a few ridges running along the wire. Once you know all that, it's really not that complicated to hook the wire into the light fixture. The next step is to add an interrupter switch. This is done on the hot side, which is the wire with sheathing that doesn't have ridges on it. It's connected in pretty much the same way that I hook the wires up to the light fixture. And in just a few minutes of work, I have a working switched light for my lantern. You don't change the light bulb from the top, so I am able to glue that piece down. Once this glue has the time that it needs to set up, the assembly of our lantern is complete. The finishing touch is added by, well, applying the finish. I'm using a hard wax oil here. I start with the base, and then I move on to the fronts. And this is where we get our shine back. I just love this part. Well, here it is. It's all complete. And I do hope that you like this one. To be honest, this may be one of my favorite build videos that I've done so far. And would you like to see it light up? We'll do that in just a minute. First, let me say that if you did like this, I would like to invite you to hit the subscribe button on the channel. When you do that, it helps other people find these videos, and you'll get to see some more videos along this line, the things that I build. I'd also like to hear any comments you might have about this particular build. A lot of the comments that went into my first build using this same stained glass epoxy technique went into the building of this particular video, so I find that super valuable. And now let's light it up. But as we do, I want to wish you farewell. May the winds bear you where the sun sails and the moons walk. Where the sun, may the wind under your wings bear you where the sun walks, no, where the sun